In this brief talk, I'm going to talk about privacy by design and all the hard bits that nobody else mentions. I'm going to mention briefly the principles behind privacy by design. That's the bit that people do talk about. And then I'm going to talk about all the practical problems that organizations face when they're trying to actually implement privacy by design. And then I'm also going to mention some of the tools that we can use to better protect the data we want to hold. Before we go into privacy by design, let's take a step back and think about information security as a whole. What is the point of information security in an organization? Well, really, the point of information security is all about making sure that the stuff that's important to us, important to our business, is safe. So what could be the stuff that's important to us? Well, it could be our top secrets for our business. It could be all the stuff that makes our business important and gives us the services that we want to sell. But really, from the point of privacy by design, what we're talking about mostly is information about people. Now, that information about people could be very, very sensitive. It could be some basic stuff like addresses. It could be information belonging to our customers, or it could be information belonging to our staff. Either way, we need to protect it properly. Well, all that sounds reasonable, doesn't it? And you'd think it'd be pretty easy to do. Well, I wish it was. It's very hard to do. It's very hard to protect the information that is important to us. And companies from all over the world, in all manner of different avenues of life, get it wrong. All these organisations listed here have got it wrong in the last few years. We have financial institutions like banks. We have got the aviation industry, there's British Airways. We've got hotel groups. You name it, we've got loads of different areas of business covered. Every single one of these organisations found out the hard way that protecting the information that they hold is actually hard to do. So what happens to organisations that either lose their customers' data or use it inappropriately? Well, they can get fined. In the UK, not long back, Facebook was fined £500,000. What did they do? Well, they were using the customer data inappropriately. I don't think Mark Zuckerberg lost too much sleep over it because it cost him all of 17 minutes of net profit. It's also worth reminding ourselves that when these kinds of large organisations lose information, they don't lose information belonging to one or two of their customers. They manage to lose it in hundreds of thousands of records, millions of records. Not really a good thing, is it? So traditionally, information security looked at 3 different areas of protection to make things safe. We'd look at the technology we used, we look at the kind of processes we put in place, and we look at how people were using that technology and processes to making sure that they were doing it appropriately. And that was fine when we had servers mostly in our server rooms in our own buildings, but these days we also think in terms of physical location because we've got all of our storage in cloud that we're using on a daily basis. So that's an extra factor we look at today too. In the information security world, there's one key measure that helps us understand how well we're protecting the information that we hold, and that's risk. In its most simplistic form, risk is simply probability of something happening multiplied by the impact of it happening. So you can have things happen that are very unlikely to happen, but if they happened, then very bad things happen. And on the other hand, you've got some things that can happen quite often, but actually they don't have much of an impact. And you end up by measuring this with some kind of risk matrix like the one shown on the screen. So maybe now we've got the basics of information security behind us, we can move on to actually talking about data privacy itself. So basically we were in a bad spot. Large organisations were losing lots of their customer information left, right and centre, and various governments around the world said maybe this is not a good thing. In Europe, they set up something called the General Data Protection Regulation, and this was discussed for years and years and years and eventually came into law a couple of years back. You may have heard about it. The key thing to remember about the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, is that it wasn't a revolution, it was an evolution. There was legislation already in place, but it was time to make it a bit stronger, to help protect people like you and me from having our information lost by large organisations. Now there's loads of information about the different principles of the GDPR, and you can find stuff like that all over the internet, so I'm not going to go into it in any great detail. Basically, if an organisation holds information on living individuals, they have to follow the 6 principles. What they do has to be lawful, fair and transparent. It has to be legitimate, explicit and specified. It has to be adequate, relevant and limited. The information they hold has to be accurate and up to date. They can only retain it for a limited time. And from an information security perspective, this is the one I'm interested in mostly, they have to have security maintained. What does that mean? And we get a hint of that in Article 25, because we have data protection by design and by default included in the GDPR. I'm not going to read it out because, let's face it, it's a mouthful, because each of these paragraphs are one sentence each. Who writes this stuff? It was great to see it explicitly mentioned in the GDPR, but it's worth saying that privacy by design is not a new idea. It's been around for a couple of decades at least. All the way back in 1995, Anne Cavoukian came up with the 7 principles for privacy by design, and you can see them listed here. Now earlier we discussed the concept of risk and how it was measured. And in most businesses, when they've been thinking in terms of risk, they've been thinking in terms of risk to the business, or risk to the data. But actually privacy by design turns all that on its head, because actually the risk we're interested in the most is the risk to the customer whose information it is that we're storing. Now it's all right talking about risk at a high level, but actually in real businesses we have a whole bunch of problems that we face on a daily basis. So let us now just have a brief reality check. Here's 9 real issues that all businesses face. A couple of these we'll talk about in a couple of future slides, the others we'll cover now. The first typical reality check is, where's our data? It's all very well saying we have to protect customer information, but in order to protect it, first of all, we need to know where it is so we can protect it. We'll cover that shortly more in a moment. The other key issue is that we all have legacy systems. It's all very well saying privacy by design is important and our customer data is important, but how do we apply that to the systems and services that we're already running? Something we'll expand on shortly again is the technical solutions that we put in place. Often we put technical solutions in place without thinking about privacy right from the get-go. Next, how do we educate our workforce to make sure that data protection, data privacy is at the heart of what we're doing within our business? Next, how do we provide governance for data protection? What about shadow IT that we have in all of our businesses? What about the data we gather constantly? What do we do with all that telemetry? How does the mentality of the staff within our organisation affect data privacy? How often have you heard, but we've always done it like that? And finally, how do we deal with the retention of customer information? We can't keep it forever, no matter what people in marketing and other departments want. The biggest problem any organisation faces when it's trying to protect customer information is knowing where it is. Now that sounds crazy. Surely businesses know where all the information is that they're trying to protect. I'm old enough to know when we used to keep servers under desks. You used to know where your data was there because you were trying not to accidentally kick it. Today it's far more complex. We have data stored everywhere. The data we're trying to protect is on production servers in data centres, potentially all over the world. It could be on our backups, both approved and unapproved. It could be on development systems, it could be on test systems, it could be on federated systems. We might have sent it to third parties. Staff might have stored it in their Dropbox or OneDrive or iCloud accounts. It might still be left on decommissioned machines. Or it could be on staff personal devices, from anywhere from the executives down towards all the developers. If we don't know where our data is, how can we protect it? And just to expand on one of those points, here's a very technical diagram, just to explain what I mean by the fact that many businesses produce technical solutions rather than privacy solutions. Just imagine now the box in red is an existing system that belongs to your business. Let's imagine that it's a system that's based in HR, and so it knows all about the people that work for our organisation. And the little grey box inside the red box is the database of colleague information. Now let's also imagine that the system in red, the red box, is quite an old system, so we don't want to spend a lot of money and a lot of time updating it. But there's some new fantastic report that's needed in HR. So rather than making massive changes to our existing system, let's create a new system the blue box, to produce this report. And we could imagine that this new system, the blue box, can talk to the old system, the red box. Maybe we could design a nice little interface so the blue box can get the bits of information it requires from the red system to produce the report. So given those requirements, the technical team come up with a design. And here's the design. And when coming up with the design, one of the problems that they faced was they didn't want to make too many changes to the red system. So instead of designing a nice little application programming interface, they instead decided to simply take a copy of the staff database every night. And in that way, they had a perfect technical solution because every 24 hours, the colleague information was updated, and it meant in the morning they could produce the report, and in doing so, they've come up with a perfect technical solution. This solution will work. But from a privacy solution perspective, this is a terrible design. It's a terrible design because we've simply duplicated a database that we didn't need to duplicate. We've spread the information around our organization and made it harder to secure this information from breach. And lastly, it's worth mentioning that this particular technical solution is something very similar to what I've seen in the real world over the last 10 years. It's based on a real example. The last thing we want to mention for our reality check on how the heck we can bring data privacy inside our organizations effectively is when we think about who has a say on privacy. In any large organization these days, there is loads of individuals within the organization that have a say on privacy. And it starts from the top with the senior executives. It includes data protection themselves, information governance, information security, developers, and everybody else in between. But generally there's one voice that's always missing, and that's the customers. And if we're going to properly implement data privacy by design, then we need to bring the voice of the customer to the heart of what we do. So how do we bring that voice to the heart of what we do? Maybe it's by introducing something called privacy engineering to our organization. Privacy engineering is a relatively new field that attempts to bring together all the different elements inside a business to ensure that we can actually implement privacy by design and default. It incorporates our organization's policies and procedures, the information framework within the organization, how we train our staff, and all the technical elements that we need in place to make sure we store personal information appropriately. We need to make sure that when we implement privacy engineering within our organizations, that we embed it in the complete service lifecycle of all of our projects and services. It starts with the requirements. We do a data protection impact assessment, more on that shortly. It's involved in the specification, the development, the testing. It's involved with how we put our services into production. It's how we deal with service continuity. And importantly, and this is the bit that's often left out as well, it's embedded in how we deal with end of life of our services. As part of that, it's worth mentioning that many organizations have embraced the use of data protection impact assessments. Although it's worth saying that still many organizations feel that the risk they're measuring is for themselves and not for their clients or customers, or the individuals whose data is going to be at the heart of this given particular system. What you see here on the screen is all the kinds of typical questions involved in a standard data protection impact assessment. Your organization may do some or all of this. So let's now talk about the tools of the trade when it comes to privacy engineering. And it's first of all worth mentioning that everything we do in privacy engineering is based on all the policies, all the procedures, all the information framework, and all the training already happening within your organization. Without that in place, the rest of this stuff just will not work. So anyway, listed here are all the kinds of things that we can control. First of all, we can bring in minimization. It's a very simple technique. It means that, unlike the previous example where we saw whole colleague databases copied from one system to another, instead, how about that when we make use of information, we use only that information that we require. So in kind of database terms, we're looking at only at the rows we're interested in and in the columns we're interested in. It's a simple technique, but actually it's not used as much as it should. We can really keep track of access control. In other words, we minimize access to our data, to only those people that should have access to it. We bring in better forms of anonymization and pseudo-anonymization. We start to use pets. Sorry, yeah, stupid dog picture because of pets. Yeah, I know. We'll use auditing, we'll use compliance, and we'll also make use of risk management. It's worth mentioning that access control is one of the biggest, most important controls we can put in place to protect customer data. But oh my God, is it hard to get right? Put your hands up if you've got grey hair because you've had to set up access control for a SharePoint site. Yeah, I feel your pain. And when it comes to anonymization techniques, I have to say, just not enough is being done. In every organisation I've ever worked at the point you ask a project manager or a program manager to make sure that anonymization is done appropriately, the two things they'll always tell you is this: it's going to cost too much. And my favourite, there's not enough time. I need to do this by next week. Neither of these things are good reasons, and we need to stop doing this. The use of anonymization must be improved in all of our organisations. One positive thing to report is that a lot of PETs, privacy-enhancing technologies, are in place in lots of organisations. Many of us are using encryption in all manner of shape or form within our business, whether it's to protect data in transit or data at rest. Key management is always a really important thing, and we need to do that carefully, but these are the kinds of controls that are effectively being used in many businesses. Effective encryption is really great for protecting information, but the problems always lie around the edges, in how it's set up and how it's used and how it's managed. One thing worth thinking about in this day and age as well is simply this: how do you delete stuff these days? How do you delete it securely? Years ago for a defence company, I had to write a report that detailed how to completely erase data on a hard disk. The confidentiality of the data on that system meant that we actually had to physically take the disk apart, install a lathe, and wipe off all the magnetic media. Now that's the way to give a secure delete. Today, way harder. And finally, when it comes to implementing privacy by design in our organisations, we've finally come up against one major hurdle. There's a big elephant in the room that we have not discussed. And it's this: what the heck do we do about our existing systems? Everything you'll ever read about implementing privacy by design is all about embedding it in new services and new systems. Nobody talks about how the heck you retrofit this stuff. And in honesty, it's really hard to do, which is why everybody tries to ignore it. So here's a list of advice for you. Why don't you just try and segregate your systems and your networks? Why don't you harden your applications? Why don't you maintain up-to-date malware protection? Why don't you apply patches when you need to? Why don't you implement good access control? Restrict special privileges. Put in your logging and monitor it. Configure your network and block all that unauthorized stuff that you don't want coming through. Maybe even, dare I say, perform regular backups and check them. Maybe engage with staff at all levels to make sure that you've empowered them to do all of that. And that all sounds very well, but have you heard it before? Yeah, that's the heart of what we do in information security. Because even with privacy by design, there's nothing really new under the sun. And as there's nothing really new under the sun when it comes to implementing privacy by design, not really. The messages that we get from all the big companies haven't really changed either. Our privacy is important to them. They have principles, and they really take care about the data on us that they hold. Yeah, right, because it's all there to make us feel safer about our privacy, but not a lot has really changed. I even spent a bunch of my own money on some domain names for Privacy Theatre. I must do something with those sites one day. But maybe I'm just being old and grumpy. Maybe things will change. If Tim Berners-Lee thinks it's fixable, maybe it is. And even the big companies are saying privacy is a big deal, and they're going to do something about it. Really doing something about it. I don't know. Maybe again I'm old and jaded, but time will tell on that one. So what are the takes on this talk on privacy by design? Well, the concepts might have been around for 25 plus years, but really most organisations still need to start thinking about how to implement privacy by design, really implement it using some form of privacy engineering at the heart of what they do. We need those companies to take those first steps. And we need those companies that have already taken those first steps to lead by example, show what can be done to keep data safe. Maybe one starting point within the industry is maybe push the concept of a privacy engineer. A privacy engineer needs to have technical knowledge, they need to have some business acumen, they need to understand the legislation that's around, and they need to be able to communicate effectively. Maybe we need to start hiring some people like this. Anyway, thanks for listening.